They didn't need iron chains to possess her, they only needed a pen and a leather book. What the British master wrote in his private ledger about Amina, under the cover of darkness, was a ritual of ownership far more cruel than any lash of the whip. It was called a corrective assignment, a secret administrative sentence that erased a woman's identity and turned her very intimacy into a line of ink. Today, we go inside the forbidden archives to reveal the ritual that history tried to hide. What we call Amina begins at that table because the table is where she reappears in the records. The ledger lists rations, clothing, and labor. Margins note alterations. A small stitched cuff with a worn name sits folded beside the volume, as if the fabric itself had tried to keep a life readable where the pages sought to erase it. The evidence we have is fragmentary. Pages trimmed, entries blurred by water, marginalia obscured by later hands. So what follows is a reconstructed account, built from ledger entries, an inspector's deposition paraphrase, and the material traces preserved in the archive. Where the documents are silent or unclear, the narrative marks that silence as indefinido. Amina was born into a house where debt bound bodies as surely as chains. The ledger suggests she entered the household ledger as a child, recorded against the master's account as property in the terms used by clerks. Her days, as the fragments allow us to imagine, were measured in small freedoms that persisted despite enclosure. She walked to a river a short distance from the house to wash linen and, for a time, to watch the light fracture across water. She mended shirts with a practiced needle. She kept a small notebook folded into the hem of her garment, a secret repository of names and brief lines of work and memory. Those minor liberties are the most intimate evidence we possess of a subjectivity that the ledger otherwise refuses to address. Across the yard, Daniel appears in the entries as a field hand, his name attached to tasks, his labor quantified in days. Between the columns of duty and pay, a folded paper turns up in a later notation. An archivist labels it hidden correspondence and notes that an inspector's report mentioned its seizure. The note itself is partly water-damaged, a line or two legible, a name repeated, a reference to an evening meeting. From such fragments, historians reconstruct a private correspondence that testifies to evenings of clandestine conversation, to attempts at companionship that persisted even inside a system designed to interrupt kinship. The discovery begins as many such stories do, with a small object found and handed onward. A household steward, noticing irregularities in rations and behavioral notes, takes the folded paper to a minister who is called to sit in for a tribunal. What the records record is a sequence of ritual and paperwork rather than a single violent scene. An inspector's deposition paraphrases the household account. A minister pronounced a corrective sentence, a coin was presented as a token, a scribe entered the result in the ledger. The words corrective assignment appear in a later marginal notation. Whether in quotes or paraphrase depends on the fragmentary condition of the original entry. But the meaning can be reconstructed, a formal reclassification imposed by household authority, carried out through ritual, symbolic economy, and administrative recording. The ritual itself, as the documents suggest, combines spiritual language with material coercion. A minister's prayer, recorded only as spoken in the margins, was paired with tangible tokens. The ledger notes an item transferred, coin given, or payment made. And the scribe's hand adds a line to the living account, a reassignment of sleeping arrangements, of supervision, of allowances. These are not merely punitive adjustments to a work schedule. The ledger's entries indicate changes that reshape social relations. Who was permitted in private spaces? Who shared a bed? Who could receive visitors? The clerk's ink does more than record. It prescribes. The entry turns an allegation or a suspicion into a durable social fact inside that household's bureaucracy. To call this practice administrative seizure is not rhetorical excess. Where whips leave scars on bodies, a ledger can wound lineage. It can determine whether a child's name appears in a family line or as a charge to the household account. It can set the terms of a woman's access to food, clothing, and privacy in ways that last beyond a single punishment. An entry that reduces a person's allowance or reassigns them to solitary quarters is not temporary if the ledger is consulted each day and each month. If inspections and subsequent entries reinforce the change, the ledger becomes a machine for rendering intimacy into a commodity, and for embedding that commodification into the mechanisms by which property and personhood are administered. We must be careful with national labels. The title names British masters. The volume we examine today is part of a collection associated with records compiled under British authority. Catalogue provenance suggests that the household operated within structures tied to British colonial administration. Yet the documents do not always state nationality in direct terms. Where provenance is clear, the ledger sits among files held in colonial administrative repositories. Where provenance is less explicit, the archive itself is cautious, and the household's precise political affiliations remain indefinito. The argument here does not rest on an unqualified national indictment. It rests on the specific mechanics visible in the ledger and on what those mechanics do to social life wherever they are applied, including in households operating under British imperial regimes, when the archival trail permits that link. The ledger's consequences are granular and cruel in their bureaucracy. A reconstructed series of entries shows how rations were adjusted, not only for supply reasons, but as instruments of discipline. A line in the ledger reduces monthly sugar allotment for failure. Another cuts cloth. Bed assignments, once private matters, are catalogued. The scribe notes bed 3 reassigned, or a margin note indicates separate sleeping. Visiting privileges vanish in a single line. No visitors permitted. A phrase an archivist paraphrases where the ink has faded. These are technical corrections that reach into the textures of daily life. Food, shelter, and the possibility of intimate contact become administrative levers. Children are the ledger's most vulnerable victims. Where a child is born in such a household, the ledger's entries determine whether that child will appear in a family register or be listed as an item of household expense. The clerk's pen can redirect a lineage from oral memory into columns marked dependents or liabilities, severing in practice, if not in sentiment, the child's recognized ties. Over generations, these entries accrete. Names vanish into ledgers and into the columns where value is minus cost. Genealogy, the ordinary way families remember themselves, meets an institutional eraser. Resistance appears not only in grand acts, but in small, stubborn traces. Among the preserved artifacts is the cuff, a strip of fabric once cut from a sleeve and carefully stitched with a name, Amina's name, reconstructed from thread where ink had been scrubbed. The cuff survives where pages were altered. Hidden letters, tucked beneath floorboards and recovered by conservationists, contain phrases of intimacy, lists of tasks, a promise to meet after dusk. A petition is found in a chest, a piece of paper folded and addressed to an inspector. An archivist's note records the petition as refused, stamped in a later hand. Each of these traces testifies to an interior life that refused total erasure. Historians reconstruct this world by reading traces against silences. Investigator Lewis copies the ledger's entries, noting the clerk's hand and the pattern of marginalia. Professor Andrews compares the household's account with other ledgers in the same collection to identify ritual phrases, corrective assignment, assigned cohabitation, that recur in similar contexts. Amelia, a conservator, works on the cuff, carefully separating fibers and noting the microscopic differences between original thread and later repairs. Together they assemble a narrative that is as much about method as it is about fact. Trimmed pages are catalogued as partially erased. Water-damaged volumes are annotated with uncertainty. Reconstructed lines are labeled as paraphrase. The work of recovery is itself a moral act, and it always proceeds with cautious language. The household tribunal that appears in the documents is a study in bureaucratic ritual. An inspector's report paraphrases how a minister read scripture, and then the steward presented a token, small coinage or a physical object, that signaled transfer or penance. The scribe transcribed the result in the ledger, not only the verdict, but the logistical matters that enforce it. Who will sleep where, who will draw provisions separately, who is barred from certain tasks. Those entries are the mechanisms by which a private assumption of authority is made public and enforceable. A corrective assignment, as the ledger lists it, is performative. Through ritual and record it becomes a policy of the household. This is where the ledger does what no lash could. A corporal punishment marks a body and, painful as it is a moment. A ledger reorders a life by the slow accumulation of administrative decisions. It places an individual within a matrix of obligation that shapes income, movement, custody, and the social recognition of relationships. The ledger's decisions travel into the future. Clerks copy entries into other volumes. Deposition notes refer back to earlier lines. The record becomes precedent. Over time, the household's book becomes a genealogical artifact, a machine that redirects kinship, remakes identity, and makes exclusion durable. Sober language is required here. We describe this as worse than death, not to trivialize physical suffering, but to make a conceptual claim about the nature of harm. Death removes a life. Administrative erasure remakes it. When the ledger removes a name from family recognition, when it converts a child into a household liability, it severs social support structures that would have been the basis for survival and memory across generations. One can imagine descendants decades later, unable to locate ancestors, because the only record records them as column entries in a ledger in which lineage is no longer legible as relationship. That is the archival form of dispossession. Not only the immediate deprivation of food or freedom, but the rerouting of future claims to identity, property, and belonging. The archival traces insist that these were not accidental byproducts, but intentional techniques. Ritual and record were used together to legitimate a form of disciplinary power. An inspector's deposition paraphrases the household's reasoning, that certain behaviors required formal correction, that the household must maintain order. The minister's role lent moral language to administrative decisions. The coin lent material practice. The scribe lent permanence. The ledger, in short, institutionalized corrective intimacy. It converted what might have been resisted or negotiated into a prescribed arrangement, recorded and enforceable. Material culture offers counter-narratives to the ledger's prescriptions. The stitched cuff is a deliberate act of naming. Where ink has been scrubbed from pages, thread retains a claim. Hidden letters are acts of refusal to let official records fully capture interior life. A petition bearing a later refused stamp nevertheless demonstrates an attempt to engage with official channels. The petition's mere presence shows that those subject to the ledger's power tried to contest it. These acts of everyday resistance are not proof of full agency. They are proof of persistence. They mark that people inside such systems cultivated ways of sustaining identity despite the ledger's remaking. The reconstructive work of historians carries its own limits and responsibilities. We cannot, and should not, read the ledger as if it were an unambiguous mirror. Pages trimmed by later hands might remove crucial language. Water-stained entries might erase who made a decision. Marginal notes could be later glosses. For this reason, every assertion is framed as reconstructed or inferred when the original is damaged. When a line appears to read, "assigned cohabitation," we mark it as paraphrased from the ledger. When a deposition uses moral language, we render it as "an inspector's deposition," paraphrases. Historians resist the temptation to fill gaps with certainty. Instead, they map the ranges of probability and point to the archival traces that make one reading more plausible than another. The ledger's bureaucratic power had real-world outcomes that extend beyond the walls of a single household. Children denied family recognition by ledger entries found it harder to claim inheritance or kin-based support. Women reassigned to those roles found their mobility curtailed and their capacity to build networks of mutual aid reduced. When a clerk writes a line that alters diet, sets sleeping arrangements, and bars visitation, those entries alter the social scaffolding that sustains life. In communities where memory is the basis for legal claims, where oral histories depend on recognized bonds, these administrative decisions operate as a kind of meta-violence. They remake the record upon which future claims depend. We must avoid equating suffering across categories or making a litany of harms that flattens experiences. The ledger's violence is not necessarily quantitatively worse than physical brutality in every sense. Rather, its particular cruelty lies in its longevity and in its capacity to reconfigure the conditions of survival and remembrance. A lash may break someone's body, but an entry may break a family's ability to be recognized as family. The ledger's inscription can, over decades, produce legacies of marginalization, children whose names do not appear in family lists, relatives unable to prove kinship, possessions shifted in the archive's account from human relations to account items. This is the interpretive claim the title makes, that bureaucratic remaking can be a harm that persists through generations. The cuff sits at the center of that claim as a witness. Its thread is a counter-ink, a material argument against erasure. Where page margins have been rubbed and entries removed, the cuff retains letters spelled out in a woman's hand or by someone who cared enough to stitch the name where the ledger had scrubbed it out. The cuff's survival matters because it shows a decided refusal to let administration be the sole arbiter of identity. The cuff is not just an artifact, it is testimony. Preserving those artifacts matters for more than historical curiosity. The ledger we opened was accessible only because conservators stabilized fragile paper, because catalogers maintained provenance, and because scholars took time to index marginalia. Archives are not neutral repositories. They are contested spaces where choices about what to preserve determine what future generations can know. Support for archival work, funding for conservation, careful cataloging, community collaboration in identifying artifacts, translates into an ability to contest administrative erasure. If the record is incomplete, if pages have been trimmed and documents water damaged, then interventions that protect and make legible what's left are small acts of justice. There are consequences for public memory too. When histories reduce enslaved people to categories in ledgers without attending to the traces of interior life, they reproduce the ledger's erasure. When historians privilege the clerk's hand without looking for the stitched cuff, when repositories index people as property, they replicate a logic of dispossession. The corrective here is method and attention, to read ledgers alongside material objects and to foreground the voices that peek through. Hidden notes, petitions, stitched names. These are the places where dignity shows itself. The final austere claim is this: bureaucratic violence converted intimacy into a set of enforceable, recorded facts. Where that conversion took place in households associated with British authority, as some of the archival provenance indicates, the ledger functioned as an instrument of imperial social control. Where provenance is less certain, the ledger's techniques nonetheless illustrate a general mechanism of domination that appears across contexts. In either case, the harm is not only immediate, it reproduces itself by creating documentation that future administrators, historians, and legal systems consult. The administrative wound is thus social and intergenerational. We close with the cuff on the table, beside the ledger. It is a small object, frayed at the edges, yet it speaks loudly in the pale light. It points to a life that did not vanish entirely into a column, to a woman who named herself even when a clerk sought to designate her as an entry. The cuff asks that we remember not only the ledger's lines, but the acts of perseverance that survived them. It asks that we preserve such artifacts and the context that make them legible. If this story has unsettled you, share it. Support local archives, donate time or resources where you can, and leave reflections that help keep these histories visible. The ledger records a particular kind of violence. Our care for archives and the work of reconstruction is one of the ways we can resist its erasures and honor the lives that tried, in quiet ways, to name themselves.